Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. On behalf of our entire Wisconsin Facet staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Today, our webinar is entitled Compassion Resilience Toolkits for Schools, Healthcare, Community, and Caregivers. Our presenter today is Sue McKenzie-Dix. She has led the development of educational programs and collaborative projects in the mental health field at the local, state, and national level. As the Vice President of Healthy Culture for Rogers Behavioral Health, she provides leadership to internal cultural efforts and facilitates WISE, the Wisconsin Initiative for Stigma Elimination. Sue works through partnerships to reduce the stigma associated with mental health challenges and increase effective supports, innovative program design, collaborative leadership skills, and a tenuous passion to share the reality and hope of recovery are key assets she brings to Rogers and to the WISE program. It's my great honor today to introduce to you Sue McKenzie-Dix. Sue?
Hi, everyone. Really glad to be here with you. If there's any issues with our audio today, I have to tell you that I'm working from home and I happen to have some construction going on downstairs. So I'm doing the best I can to minimize any of that. If that becomes a problem, just be sure to let Bonnie know. So I am really glad to be spending this next hour with you, and I'd love to start with just asking us all to breathe, to focus on what's happening in the internal self, and take a moment to follow your own breath as it comes into your body and leaves your body. And throughout our time, just to give yourself that gift of checking in with something as simple as the breath and how it's supporting us through some really rough times. We're not going to focus a whole lot on those rough times today because it's not news to anybody, right? So I just invite you to take this next hour to learn with me, and also to give yourself that gift of focus from now and then on your breath. So the goal for our time is to build your capacity to shape a compassionate and resilient organization and family. We want to take the lens of professionals in our communities, and also as family members, and be able to see how these concepts apply across our life. Want to explore what leadership, staff, parents, family, what are the practices that whatever role we play and the multiple roles that we play, what are the practices that can establish and maintain the cultures that we would like to live in? And then hopefully give you what you need to be able to continue some of these important conversations into the future. I want to start just by asking us to think for ourselves, why do this work? Well, why would we want to stop and focus on this notion of increasing compassion? What do you hope the outcome would be in your family, in your workplaces, if compassion were practiced more consistently? What would it mean for you if you could come from a place of compassion even more than you already do? What would the benefit of that be? In the research for these toolkits that I'm going to be presenting to you today, it's really, really clear that there's much to be gained for all of us as individuals, teams, and organizations to increase our capacities around compassion. If anyone would like a list of some of those researched outcomes, more than happy. I will be sharing my email with you. I did in the beginning, I will at the end, of how to reach me. But if anyone is interested in those specific research pieces, we're very happy to share those with you. So the toolkits that I'm going to be talking about today, there is various versions. The content is, the concepts are the same. How we approach the concepts differs a little bit from toolkit to toolkit. But so there is a school-focused toolkit, there is a Health and Human Services toolkit, and there is one for parents and caregivers. And I'm going to be sharing the kind of outline of content and what that looks like with you. And we'll, again, try to ask ourselves from different lenses what this content might mean for us. I do want to say that the website, compassionresilienceToolkit.org, all of the resources on the website are completely free to you. When you go to the website, the screenshot that you have here on this slide is we've gone to the website and we've clicked into the schools toolkit. And you'll see that we give one of the circles is some background on what is compassion resilience. That's where you can kind of go and get the overview if you want to share with others what this notion of compassion resilience is and why we need to focus on it. And then the second circle, whether you're in the schools, the parent caregiver, health and human services, helps you look at how do we do this work? What does it look like to put the resources in this toolkit into play in your organization or in your family? And then the get started is where the actual toolkit resources are, and they are laid out based on 12 concepts. And in each concept area, we give it's a very consistent set of resources. So you start off with some information that can be shared either prior to or following a group conversation about the concept. So we decided that when human beings come together, it's such precious time that we really wanted it to be more exploration of a concept rather than learning it. So we've created some materials that help people to, for instance, when we talk about expectations, you can send it out as a pre-read and people can begin to think about expectations so that when they come together in small groups or larger groups, they're ready for the application conversation. That's really what we want to be able to facilitate, is people talking about what does this mean for me, for my organization, for my family right now. And then there's also in each one of the 12 concept areas, there's some self-care support, self-care strategies. There are visuals that can be used, downloaded and enlarged. So there's kind of a whole set of resources around a concept, and then you move on to the next concept, and those resources are available to you there as well. And so the content of the 12 areas is first in the first 3, we're looking at what do we mean by compassion? What does it look like in action? What does it mean to be fatigued? How does that play out? So we're really trying to develop some common language and awareness. And then when we move into 4 through 7 is where we're starting to talk about what can we do together in our family groups, in our teams, in our organization, in our community groups. And then 8 through 11 focuses more deeply on self-care strategies that are woven throughout, but we do focus 8 through 11 on those. And then the last area of content is, in the school's case, it's making compassionate connection with parents. In the other toolkit, we talk about it as kind of second tier. We kind of come to this thinking about who is it that are kind of our first level of where we're practicing compassion. And then we push a little bit to let's look beyond that, because sometimes it's easier to respond with compassion to the people that we are closest to, or we maybe have a job that's focused on. And we push that to what about the people in that second tier? What does it mean to act with compassion towards them? And then there's some appendices that offer further support to the concepts that are available in the toolkit. The foundational beliefs about behavior are based really tightly on Ross Greene's work. And if you've done any reading or exposure to Ross Greene, it's looking at what do we actually believe about people's behavior, because that can be a beginning reason of why we might be fatigued if we have false beliefs about behavior. And then we look at how do we support change in ourselves and others. There's some good information here on how you apply the stages of change or motivational interviewing to some of these concepts. And then we look at what do we do if we experience some significant needs while we're facilitating this toolkit. And then what does stress look like throughout the career cycle?
Excuse me, Sue.
Yes.
Sorry. If you were advancing your slides, none of them have advanced on the screen.
Well, how do we make that happen? I definitely have been advancing my slides.
So I don't know.
I think what I'm going to do then is, let me try this. Well, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm just going to totally take off my second screen and get us back to one screen and see. So you should be seeing my slides, but they're not in full slide view yet, right?
Right, right, right.
So let me get back here. Thank you so much for breaking in, because that's very important. And I am going to excuse my technical difficulties. I'm going to move a mouse so that I can, I'm on one screen. There we go. I think we're driving now. So I'm going to go back just because I want you to visually see what I talked about, our goals. Then I talked about understanding why we do this work in the first place. This is where I was showing you the screenshot of the internet site where you find all of these resources. And this was the slide where I walked through the content sections. And why don't I just pause and see, because you didn't have those visuals, why don't I pause before I go on to see if there are any questions?
Actually, I don't have any questions at this time, so I think we're okay. And you are advancing to full screen now, so everything is working great now.
Awesome. All right. So I wanted to take a moment to talk about how we got to this topic. As you heard, I've been one of the facilitative leads of WISE, Wisconsin Initiative for Stigma Elimination. And in our kind of think tank, working with all kinds of organizations across Wisconsin in partnership to figure out how we can address and eliminate stigma, we started to look at what it is that people who experience stigma, what they say about where they experience stigma. And the reality was that people experience stigma in some of the very places that have the intention to be helpful and positive: schools, faith communities, healthcare. And so we started to say, let's back up and think about why this is. So again, we asked people with lived experience about their stigma experience. And we asked them, why do you think that therapist treated you in that way that felt stigmatizing? Why do you think this teacher who, job it is to care for your child might have responded in ways that felt stigmatizing to you? And across the board, even people who had some pretty challenging experiences were able to say, first of all, we understand that mental health is a topic area that's pretty gray, that we understand that even with good intent, people can be frustrated because maybe their caseloads are high or they don't have the information they feel they need to be able to help me. What I heard was people who had experienced stigma being extremely compassionate to the very people that they might have had that experience with. And so we needed to take that information and we stepped back and we started to look at, why do people in helping professions not always act in the way that they intend? And that's how we got to the compassion fatigue and compassion resilience information. Another area that we realized was that the trauma-informed care movement, whether it's trauma-informed care in a health and human services perspective or trauma-sensitive schools, that one of the unintended consequences for the work to really help people to understand the experience of trauma and how we needed to be open to the stories of people's lives is that for many people, they weren't trained in how to have an open and yet protected heart, how to hear hard things and be able to care for themselves in the midst of what they were hearing. And so for even greater impetus for us to work on this Compassion Resilience Toolkit. One of the big pieces that we recognized was that if we were going to be looking at compassion resilience, that this toolkit needed to help people take a look at perspective shifting. What does it mean to think about something in one way and be open to shifting our perspective on that? This is just one of the activities that's in the toolkit to help people begin to practice perspective shifting. We ask people to take a look at the kinds of things that bring them joy and the kinds of things that feel depleting to them. And we do just a fun activity where we ask people to get together and think about in their daily life what activities are nourishing. And oftentimes in their talking with a partner, they realize that the very thing that I might find nourishing, someone else could find depleting. And they have pretty safe conversations. They get curious without us asking them to get curious because it's a safe topic area. And so they begin to have conversations. Why in the world would you think folding laundry was nourishing when to me it's the worst job I have in the house, right? So we can have that pretty safe conversation about a different perspective. And then we back up when we talk about how can we take that same level of curiosity and lack of defensiveness into some of the harder conversations that allow us to be less stigmatizing and more compassionate in our families and in our workplaces. So I want to start going through the concepts that are in the toolkit with you. And in the first section of the toolkit, we look at this notion of what does it actually mean to act with compassion? And to act with compassion, we looked at various researchers and tried to synthesize it down to a digestible set of steps. And so the first step of compassionate action is to be able to be present enough to notice when someone else is experiencing pain. And so for some of us, that means that I can be present enough to notice that behind someone's anger or behind someone's outburst is potentially a feeling of pain. It may mean that I look behind someone's behavior that is someone who's following all the rules and wanting to get everything perfect, and I'm actually feeling kind of glad that person is in my midst because they make my life easier. It means, am I present enough to notice that maybe behind that desire to be perfect is a level of pain? And we also talk in this first stage that none of us can be 100% present 100% of our day. And so this very first step of being compassionate involves me being self-aware enough to notice this is probably not the time when I'm even going to be able to notice what's going on around me. We find in professional situations, often it's the first half hour or last half hour of the day, we're less present to notice what's happening around us. And so if I'm going to act with compassion, I need to be honest with myself and be able to communicate to somebody else that I really want to be here for you. This is probably not the time I'm going to be able to bring my best self. Could we talk first thing in the morning, or can we talk over the phone later? So that first step already can lead us into understanding why the very act of compassion can be fatiguing at times. So once I notice if one of you are in pain and you're in my midst and I have a sense that you're in pain, or maybe you've made it very clear to me that you're in pain, the next thing I need to do is to go internal. And when I go internal, I need to ask myself, what am I thinking and feeling right now? Is it serving me? Can I set this aside? We as human beings are wired to group things into categories from the days when we put the red blocks in one pile and the blue blocks in another. Our brains work to categorize. And if we are going to act with compassion, we have to be able to stop that initial categorizing so that we can move on to that next step, which is to seek to understand the individual. And so, we've all done this as parents, right? It's easy to say, oh, this is like the last time, versus being able to check ourselves and set aside our initial assumptions to seek to understand the current situation. And then we talk about this third step of seeking to understand that, again, natural way of human beings when we seek to understand, sometimes we're looking for all the details of a situation. Now, why did you say that to her? And what were they doing? And when did this happen? And really the overarching thing when we're trying to act with compassion that we're trying to understand is, first of all, what are the feelings that this person is experiencing in this situation. And then I want to listen for what are the strengths that I hear coming through. Even in the midst of them expressing their pain, is there some area of strength that I will be able to use later in this process? So if I understand what this person is feeling, if I've listened for that and I checked with them, sounds like you're feeling frustrated here. No, I'm actually not frustrated. I'm just really angry. Okay, thank you. That's helpful. So I'm trying to get at the feeling. And the reason I'm getting at the feeling is for me to be able to stay in a compassionate place, I need to be able to connect in with empathy. It doesn't mean that I need to get every detail of the situation or agree with every detail of the situation. It simply means that I'm able to connect to a place in myself where I felt anger, or I felt frustration, or I felt embarrassment. And if I can connect to that, I'm going to stay out of a place of judgment, and I'm going to continue my path of curiosity. So what I want to avoid here, and what one of the big pitfalls is when I move from empathy to the next stage, is sometimes when I go, oh yeah, I've felt anger before, let me tell you what I did about that anger. We want to avoid that. I want to let that connection to someone else's feeling keep me in a place of empathy and curiosity, so that I can then move to this next really important stage, and that is to work with that person to help them discern their next best action. It's not about me giving advice. It's about me helping them to get to a clear enough mind to be able to discern what action is best for them. And so how do I help them to get to a clearer mind? That's where those strengths that I've listened for come in. I may say something as simple as, wow, it took a lot of strength for you to just articulate what's going on with you right now. Or when I listen to you talk about that very frustrating situation, I noticed that you made some really important decisions not to act impulsively, even though you were feeling such frustration. So when I can the reason I want to bring those strengths back is, for one, if my brain is really caught up in a particular emotion, when someone offers me a perspective of my strength, it starts to free my brain up to be able to become more of a problem-solving brain and less of a reactive brain. So one of the reasons. And also, obviously, in discerning best action, I'm going to need some of the tools from my past to be able to apply to this situation. People often ask me, is it ever okay to offer advice? And absolutely, yes, it is. But these are the caveats. The caveats are that you have really done due diligence to help this person connect to their own strengths and their own ideas. And if you get to that place where this person truly seems stuck, first of all, you say, it seems like you're stuck. Is that right? Hard for you to think of options right now. And if that person says, yes, they're stuck, then secondly, you ask for permission. So I have some ideas that some others have shared with me. Are you interested in hearing them? Are you even in a place to be able to hear them right now? If I can ask it in that way, then I can offer, well, here's one idea. Then of course I want to go right back to, how does that sit with you? From all your own knowledge and wisdom, how does that sit with you? That's what discerned best action looks like. And then our last step of compassionate action is us deciding what's the action the person wants to take next and what can I do to support them in it. And I want to be really clear that I don't promise anything that I'm not going to do, because that, of course, we all know from our trauma-informed lens that that really breaks that relationship that has been built in the conversation. So I will not be spending as much time in the other sections as I have on this one, but because this is so foundational for our work, we really want people to understand what we mean by compassion, because when we start talking about boundaries and expectations, you're going to understand how critical they are to support the process of compassion. I also want to say, we do this training for groups of facilitators. So in schools and healthcare organizations, community youth serving organizations, for parents leading parent groups. We train people how to facilitate these groups. so that they can do this work in our communities across our state and beyond. What's up on the screen right now is just an example of an activity in section 1 where we're talking about compassionate action. We put up various scenarios, and of course the best scenario is the scenario that is most relevant to your group. So this just happens to be a scenario that we typically do with teachers. And we ask the teachers to read through the scenario. I'm not going to go through this with you, but it's clearly a scenario that puts people into a place of judgment rather quickly. And then we begin to walk through those steps of compassionate action and help them to apply them to that particular scenario. What did you learn in your self-check? What would you do to seek to understand? What feeling might this person be having that you can relate to? Did you ever in your career feel like you wanted to go over and above for a kid, even though you knew it was breaking some of the boundaries? Helping them to come to a place of empathy. And then we really do the gut check, which is, I think, an important, what I call the gut check of compassionate action. Do I really believe that this person has the answers inside of themselves and that I can listen them into their own wisdom rather than me being the person trying to give all the wisdom in this situation? So that's part of the work that we do in section 1. And then we move into section 2, where we're now going to kind of back up and talk about, so what do we mean by resilience and fatigue and wellness and self-compassion?
Sue, are you willing for a question right now?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. So in evaluating the steps that you've just gone through, it seems to the person asking the question that the hardest part is, if someone sort of like is stuck and doesn't know what to do as far as discerning best action, how do you do a reality check with that person if you believe that it's not necessarily they're coming from a point of reality?
Yeah, that's really a good question. So they're so stuck that they can't see next step. I'm just going to read into this and see if I've got it right. They're so stuck. And, sometimes what I'm thinking it looks like is this is the end of the world. You don't understand. That catastrophizing that we often do when we're in a painful place. And so we have a resource in this section that looks very specifically at strategies when you're moving into the discerning best action piece. And so that's there for you on the website, which will help answer this question a lot. But just briefly, what I would say is, some of these, first of all, some of these conversations, we're not talking about it all happens in one conversation. It may be that this person simply needs to feel heard and accepted in their stuckness in the moment. And so, us fix-it folks like to get to that problem solving, and we may walk away from that initial conversation feeling, oh, I didn't help at all because we didn't get to a next step. But, certainly what I would want to do is to say, I'm here tomorrow. How about we get back together again to help move that forward? And if the person, it seems like they're ready enough for you to make some observations, I think couple of things that I often offer is just naming, you seem really stuck. It sounds like you don't believe there's a solution. Like even if I offered you some possible solutions, it would be hard for you to even believe that's possible right now. So I'm trying to through empathy, define what it is I'm seeing, where they're at right now. And sometimes just by naming that, they're able to say, yeah, I can't imagine, but I'm willing to continue in the conversation. Sometimes I offer, especially if the solution isn't something that I can say I've personally experienced, I want to connect them. We know, of course, the voice of lived experience is so powerful. What a great place to think about in that particular moment. Has this ever happened to you before, or is anything close to this ever happened to you before, is often a good question, because it helps the person begin to say, well, it wasn't, let's say their mother just passed away. Well, it wasn't the same, but I know I was really depressed when XYZ happened and I couldn't imagine tomorrow. okay, well, this seems much deeper. What worked then? And so those are some of the strategies that help in that place. Hope that was helpful to you.
Yes, thank you very much. That's the only question I have at this time.
Okay, all right. So, we're in section 2. I want to point out that our definition of compassion resilience, I think you would certainly assume this first one is kind of a dictionary definition of that power to return to a position of empathy, strength, and hope. I really love the second definition, to be optimistic in an imperfect world. So much of what we're doing is we deliver this information in communities and we train others to deliver the information. We're just seeing, and wow, let's talk 2020. What an imperfect world we're in. And for me to act with compassion, I have to find some level of optimism in every situation so that I can put one foot in front of the other. And I think that's really what we're asking of ourselves is, what is it that will build our ability to find optimism when we're in an imperfect world, an imperfect situation, imperfect people, imperfect jobs? There's all kinds of ways that we experience that. Probably the most important aspect of section 2 is the look at self-compassion. We had this later on in the toolkits, more towards those section 8 to 11 that are about self-care practices. But boy, when we started doing this work, especially when we started doing this work with parents, it was very clear we got to get self-compassion right up front. Because like so many other things, it's hard for me to love someone else if I don't love myself. It's very hard for me to practice compassion for others if I can't practice it on myself. And so we go fairly deep into self-compassion. We connect with Kristen Neff's work. There's actually an online assessment, free online assessment that does a lot of the teaching around self-compassion. That's a part of this toolkit as well. And again, all of that is free. Then we move into trying to understand compassion fatigue. So this slide is just some of the words around it. It's that gradual lessening of compassion. It's when I really try to avoid understanding what people are facing. Most of us are parents and in roles in our job and in our communities because we care and we want to understand. When we start backing up from that, that's a pretty clear sign that we're moving into compassion fatigue. And overall, life isn't as satisfying. So why would we want to live like that if we can find ways to find deeper satisfaction and more resilience? This visual is the most used visual of the toolkit. It is our stages of compassion fatigue. I'm going to walk through it briefly with you. And I ask as I go through it for you to imagine and think to yourself, have I ever been in this cycle of fatigue? So the first stage of fatigue is actually the zealot stage. That is when we typically are new to something. We're committed, we're involved, we're raising our hand, we'll work the extra hours, we'll give it all we got. And it's actually the first stage of fatigue because most of our work that we do in the world, whether it's with our families or professionally, they're marathons, they're not sprints. And so we say the best thing we can do to support each other is when someone is new to whatever they're new to, that rather than putting things on their plate, we actually help them to understand how to run the marathon versus how to prepare for sprints. And as we are running that marathon early on in our career or our role as a parent, we begin to notice that imperfection in the world. We begin to notice that our systems aren't all that they need to be to support the very people we care about. We notice imperfections in ourselves, that maybe we don't have all that we need to do the work that we so desire to do, or our colleagues, or maybe we focus on children and we're a little upset that families aren't providing kids all that they need. There's all kinds of ways that we begin to notice the reality of imperfection, and that can lead us to this place of cynicism and anger, sadness, helplessness, hopelessness. I'm guessing that many of us have felt this year over various things. And some of us may even have felt that we were kind of stuck ourselves in knowing what to do, how to respond, how to stay healthy, how to be resilient. And if we don't have those strategies and we don't practice them, the natural human reaction is to withdraw. The complexity of life can be overwhelming, and it can lead to chronic exhaustion, hard to empathize, We talk about absenteeism. I think a lot about presenteeism, which means I'm there, but I'm really not all there. And so you can begin to see how important it is that we have skills and strategies to intervene early and to get realistic about our expectations. If we haven't had support and figured some of this out, we move into the zombie phase. And yes, we found a zombie cat there. And in the zombie phase, it's that sense that we start to put up walls. All this whole process is like a slow process of isolating. And by the time you're in the zombie stage, you're kind of that do it alone person. You know, I'm just going to go in and do my job, and I'm not going to connect with anyone else. I know what to do today. And sometimes we even get that overinflated sense of our own importance because we've become so isolated. And so it's a very hard place to be, a lot of sleeplessness, sense of persecution. And again, if we don't have some helpful intervention, this is often where we find people leaving the profession. Sometimes it looks more like, you know, I taught third grade and those third graders are just unbelievable. So now I'm in fifth grade and life is going to be so much better. And that's why I would say many of us have been around this cycle various times in our careers or within our families. And so our goal clearly is that we learn the strategies of compassion, of resilience, and not just when we get to that zombie phase, but early on in our careers and our experiences, we understand how to avoid this. So I'm going to move on to the next areas of the toolkit to give you an idea of, now we've kind of set the scene to understand what it means to be compassionate, what it means to be fatigued. We look at both individually, and our teams can be fatigued, our organizations, and what's our role to help us all to be resilient. And so now we're going to delve into the deeper concepts of what drives our fatigue and what can we do to control it. Section 4 is one of the critical sections of the toolkit. This is when parents and professionals start to say, oh, okay, this is real stuff. Because we fill the wall with all the drivers of fatigue as well as the drivers of resilience. And what initially feels like a big complaint session really takes a turn when we start to ask people to circle the things they can control and cross out the things they can't control. And we have conversations about why people in the same position have a sense of control over something that I don't feel like I have any control over. We put big L's next to the things that we look to leadership to have some control over. And leadership then is prepared to be transparent and take a look at that list and be able to look at their own sense of where they have control and don't have control, and be able to feed back to the staff. You know, this is something we want to work on in the next year, and this needs to go to our we can't control for now list. So it's really an important place of both understanding what drives fatigue and resilience and beginning to look at where's our accountability. And we begin to have some of those courageous conversations. We come out of section 4 and we start to look at expectations. Really such an important one. And I think so much about 2020 and how hopefully all of us have changed some of our expectations of ourselves, our jobs, our families, our organizations to be realistic for our context. You know, the fact that I've watched more TV in the last 6 months than I think I have in my life, you know, my expectation coming into all this was that I wouldn't be watching a whole lot of TV. I needed to change to get to a more realistic expectation of myself, because the unrealistic expectations that others have of us and we have ourselves are key drivers of fatigue. So we got to get a handle on expectations. And that's what section 5 really looks at. The self-care aspect of section 5 is we start to look at, when I find an unrealistic expectation I have of myself, what's the affirmation that I can work with to help turn that unrealistic expectation around? So my TV example is, my affirmation is, Sue, you're not always going to watch this much TV, and you're actually making some pretty good choices in terms of the content of what you're watching, right? That's an affirmation that's much more in line with the realism of our current times. Section 6, we move from those expectation setting, and once we get really clear, realistic, and aspirational expectations, then we want to talk about boundary setting. And this boundary setting piece is we put we ask people to think about what is it they want to say yes to in their life? Kind of what are those key priorities? What do I want to in my day say yes to? And then the boundaries are simply the no's to support my yeses. So we lead very strongly with yes. And a lot of people, a lot of caring, passionate people aren't really good at saying no, at setting boundaries. And it's because we think of boundaries as a bunch of no's. But when we turn it around to think of boundaries as really about some key yeses, it allows us to formulate our no's based on those yeses. And so we walk through, get some very clear examples of yeses in people's life, and we help to formulate what the no's are that they might need to be comfortable setting. We use a wonderful Brene Brown quote in this section that talks about how our setting our boundaries is really a very compassionate act, and that if we don't set those compassionate boundaries, that we tend to be people who live in resentment. And that is so stuck with me. I now look in my life, when I start to feel resentful towards somebody, I ask, Sue, what boundary didn't you set here? And could you have set that boundary much earlier so that you don't allow yourself to get into a place of resentment? Again, when we're working in professional settings, we're having all of these conversations, not just about individuals, but about teams and the organization as well. We do not believe that this should be an exercise focused on individuals being more resilient, but what do our teams and our organizations need to do to create resilient cultures? So that leads us to 7, which is where we really look deeply at culture. And the outcome of section 7 is our culture agreements, where we come together and decide what is the culture we want to live in, and what are the behaviors that'll get us to that culture. And then 8 and 11 is where we start to look through self-care strategies. So I'm going to walk through just visually what it is that I said to you to help kind of anchor that information a little bit. So as I said, those system drivers of compassion fatigue. This is an example of a group of parents and what they came up with. We do this all virtually now. And so this is an example of a board that we did with parents. The green were the areas where they felt like they had control. The red were areas where they felt like they didn't have a lot of control. We often underline it if there's disagreement, because it's not about consensus. It's actually kind of good to notice where there's some disagreement among groups, so we can talk about, have good conversations about how we perceive control. So of course, drivers of fatigue for parents, that children's sleep schedule, that would make a lot of sense. And some people felt like maybe they could control that, and others weren't so sure. And so what a great opportunity to talk about where different people have strengths and information. Drivers of resilience, quality time. That, when I can spend quality time with my family, it really makes me resilient. And others weren't sure that they had so much control over that. So what a great conversation. In expectations, these are some of the questions that we ask. What are the positive role? What are the impacts of those unrealistic expectations you had on yourself, expectations of others? And then how do you assess if expectations are being set at a helpful aspirational level for yourself or the ones you set for others? We like to look back and remind ourselves of the resilience of the people that we care about. Often our expectations can be low. We think a lot about our expectations being too high, but often they're too low because we don't really understand the resilience of each other. And so we talk about how important story is and understanding resilience. This is a poem that we use to start our compassionate boundaries section. We often think of it as being nice. And why we don't want to set a boundary is because we want to be nice, but we begin to understand that boundaries are actually a loving act. Those helpful adult behaviors, I said, we start to really identify those helpful adult behaviors, and then what are the boundaries that we can set? Our tips for setting boundaries is, like I said, know your yes. Be proactive about that. We all know what it's like to have someone say, oh, I haven't liked what you've been doing for the last month. And usually your first reaction is, well, why didn't you tell me at the beginning of the month instead of telling me now? It breaks trust. And so practicing being proactive with our boundary setting, being really simple and clear, sticking with it in the moment when you see a violation. Hey, remember we talked about that? People really want to support our boundaries. We need to give them that credit and be willing to have those conversations. Here's just a couple examples. So imagine an angry youth, maybe an angry child of yours. And this is a boundary statement. I really want to work with you to figure this out. That's the yes. I really want to do this with you. My boundary, it's going to be really hard if our brains are not calm enough to think. So how about we take a 5-minute break? That's a pretty kind, compassionate, but very clear boundary. And then people often ask, well, what do I do if someone above me that has more power than me? How do I set a boundary with them? So this is an example. Although our district goals are really important to me, that's one yes. I need to discuss what can come off my plate or what I can do in a different manner in order to take on anything new. I'm working on how to balance my family's needs and my workload. That's another yes, right? 2 yeses in there with a request in the middle. I have asked, every time we show this slide in groups, I ask supervisors, would you want someone to come to you with this kind of a statement? And I've gotten 100% yes. This is how they view their role as a supervisor, to be able to have these kinds of conversations. Oh, here's that Brené Brown quote. Compassionate people ask what they need, say no when they need to, and when they say yes, they mean it. They are compassionate because their boundaries keep them out of resentment. So the culture section that I mentioned, we move forward and we actually design agreements, team agreements or family agreements, organizational agreements. Then this is just one of our self-care activities that people ask a lot for this slide. We've done a lot of work already in the toolkit with the group by now, where they're thinking about how they relate to others. And of course, there's going to be people that have come to mind that maybe are a little tougher for them in their life. And so this is a mindfulness practice where we ask people to bring to mind that person that's a little tougher for you, to bring up compassion in different situations, and to practice this mindful piece of going internally and saying to yourself, just like me, this person seeks happiness. Just like me, they work to avoid suffering. Just like me, they've known sadness, loneliness, and despair. Just like me, they're seeking to fill their needs. And just like me, they're learning about life. This little mindfulness practice is something that has served my team well, and we often tell stories about when we've been challenged and when we've gone internal and used this mindfulness practice to be able to show up with compassion. So an example of the kinds of things woven throughout. Sections 8 through 11 are the self-care practices, and I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time on this one because I think we as a culture lately have done a lot of talking about self-care and maybe not a lot of talking and working on some of the stuff that I brought you already. So those 4 sections look at the mind. We look at mindfulness, we look at growth mindset, we look at our ability to organize. One activity is appreciative inquiry, reflection on our own competence. Because if I walk into a situation not feeling competent, that really impacts that situation. And that also obviously ties back to realistic expectations of myself. In the spirit area, we look at our core values and how they align, in this case, with the school mission or with just our family mission. We look at how we balance work and play. In the strengths section, we look at stress resilience. There's a wonderful TED Talk here by Kelly McGonigal that really challenged some of our notions about stress and its impact on our lives. And then what are the healthy habits that we're able to build around our physical well-being? And how do we end unhealthy habits? And then lastly, we look at self-compassion. We revisit it again, and then we look at emotional regulation. We talk a lot about emotional regulation planning for kids in our culture. This asks us as adults to look at our own emotional regulation planning and how we can be supported in our relationships to manage the emotions that we have. And then, as I mentioned, section 12 is where we take a look at that next circle of people around our primary folks that we focus our care on. So all that content, we then look at what are the next steps? What can we do to take this content and bring it into our communities? And how does that happen? So I want to just go back to the slide, and I want to open it up for questions on the content or any questions about how this gets delivered in communities across our state.
Well, we have one question, Sue, and that's how do you get the person to buy into what you're trying to do?
So I'm going to answer that at two levels. So we train, people get excited about this content, and they typically go back to their organization and say, hey, I think my organization could use this. So that's one place that you might be asking the question about. And we support people in that process. So you could email us and say, really liked what I heard today. I think my organization could use this. Help me for how I can present this information to my organization. And we do it all the time. We give you the information. We can connect you with other organizations like yours who are currently doing this work. Oftentimes, I think the business case for this is something we can help with. And like I said, we have research that we can help with. So we can help people if they're feeling like this is information they want to bring back to their organization. I also heard on another level, just individually, this is something I might be working on in my own life. How do I get someone else to come along with me? And honestly, I find most often in my life, when I'm acting with compassion based on these principles, people notice it and they ask about it. And I'm very honest with people. If you would have known me at 16, at 18, at 24, you would not have seen this human being that's standing in front of you now. That all of this is about us growing as human beings, and we learn different strategies and practice them. And that's pretty much how I invite people in, by telling them the impact of some of these concepts on my own life.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any other questions for you at this time.
Okay, I guess one of the things I would like to end with is this next slide. Compassion Resilience Toolkit.org and WISE at wisewisconsin.org, the email. We offer training to teams from organizations, as well as there's training for parent leaders to be able to implement the toolkit in whatever sector you're interested in implementing it. And you could get that information by emailing WISE at wisewisconsin.org.
Okay, thank you very much, Sue. We greatly appreciate your presentation today. I know that I learned a lot, and I'm sure that those in attendance today did as well. This concludes our webinar. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Please be advised that Wisconsin Facets has trainings and webinars for the remainder of the year, and please check our website calendar and register for any of those upcoming trainings that may be of interest to you. Also, please be advised that next year we'll have over 100 scheduled trainings and webinars for 2021. Please watch for the short evaluation that will be coming your way after today's live presentation. Again, Sue, thank you for your presentation today. And thank you everybody for joining us. Bye-bye, everybody.